So welcome back. This is the final session of today's virtual conference focusing on victims. And we've had some fantastic speakers and guests that have joined me live on Facebook today. And the last session, I'm really pleased that Dame Vera Baird has agreed to come on and have a conversation about victims, because you're the Victims Commissioner, Vera. So welcome. Thank you for supporting this conference, and really interested to get a perspective from you as the Victims Commissioner in terms of, what we should be doing, really. We've had conversations today with the force. We've had conversations with Her Majesty's HMCTS. I was trying to remember the acronym. I couldn't. HMCTS, the Court and Tribunal Service. We've also had researchers from Aberystwyth University working on the older sort of victims of domestic abuse talking to us, and we've also had Embrace Child Victims of Crime. So we've had both ends of the spectrum and everything in the middle, really. So you've had an illustrious career, Vera. You're the Victims Commissioner. What do you want to sort of start with? What are the things that you want to hit us with this afternoon?
Shall I tell you a bit about my role? Because it's not that well understood. And I'm the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales. And I'm very proud to say that my first public appearance as Victims Commissioner was in Wales. It was at a domestic abuse conference organised by Rachel Williams down a bit further south. But I just want to swank about my Welsh connections, if I may, for a minute, which are these. So I can't overstate them. But my grandfather was Welsh. He lived in Gwersalt, which I think is near Wrexham. And so my father half Welsh, which makes me 1/4 Welsh. And it is reputed that I'm the only person in the family who has red hair, apart from my grandfather, who I didn't know. He died before I was born. So there we go. A kind of living expression of Celtic origin. But I am very fond of Wales. One of my closest friends lives right in the south in Langland, just west of Swansea, and I go there every Christmas. And I would have been there many times in the last few months, but we haven't been going anywhere. So apart from that, the Victims Commissioner role, my role, as you know, before I took this on, I was a police and crime commissioner like yourself in Northumbria, the northeast of England. So this role is to promote the interests of victims and witnesses, to encourage best practice in the way victims and witnesses are dealt with, and to keep under review the Victims Code. And I will say, sorry, I'll switch my phone off. I will say a little bit more about the Victims Code, if I may, presently, because there's just been a new version of it, which is better than it's ever been before. So those are my obligations. And if this were a PowerPoint, the next slide would be, what are my powers? And that would be completely empty, because I don't have any. There are no powers at all attached to the Victims Commissioner role. We have a budget of £500,000 for England and Wales. I have 8 staff, 6 of whom are part-time. And so we have to use, our advocacy. We have to make very deep and wide links with the victims community, with those who represent victims, bring all that in, and then try to use our advocacy, our lobbying skills, make alliances to get the people who can deliver better treatment for victims, notably ministers, judges, HMCTS, etc., to get them to take on what we find out from, as it were, our other connections. So that's how it works. And the other thing we do, which may be of interest because we've just done a paper, is we do research. So I have 2 excellent researchers who look into particular themes of victimization and how well we're doing and how badly we're doing there. Or in the case of the new paper, they have looked at, with the assistance of about 20 small round tables, what should be in the victims law. Because the government has committed itself to a victims law, although I have to say it's taken its time getting round to it. They was in their 2005 manifesto, but they do intend to introduce one presently. So we've done a whole paper with 34 recommendations, which we've just published recently, which we hope is going to be influential in their thinking.
Yeah. So Vera, you mentioned there previously that you were a police and crime commissioner. So we got to meet each other in various meetings, and we were on the
association. We were both on the executive, as I recall.
On the board for a while together. But what I was going to say, if I can get away with saying this to you, you say that the powers slide, if it was a PowerPoint, would be empty. But I know you well enough that the power of persuasion that you will bring to bear will be quite significant, and I'm sure that's partly why you will be such a fantastic victims commissioner, because things will get done. If I've sort of got to know you well enough over the last few years, things will get done.
I think it's the same is true of you, actually, David. You also seem to get things done with fair old dispatch. And yeah, I think an advantage I definitely have is that I was myself a minister in the Blair government, in doing Ministry of Justice work for 1 year, and then I was the Solicitor General for several years. So I've been a minister, so I'm not frightened of them. And of course, most of them know, in fact, they all know that I've been a minister, and so they can't kind of bamboozle me nor expect me to, bow as I come through the door, which is great. And also, originally I was a criminal barrister, Queen's Counsel in the end, and so I'm very used to talking to judges as well. And in a way, I think, doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to do better, but it does mean that I understand the world, in the worlds in which the people work who I need to give me what victims need. So I think that's probably a bit of an advantage. But as you've shown this morning, if you've had some young people and some older people's victims advisors and charities on, how diverse the range of victims is. And they run, from people who suffer antisocial behavior, are much, much underestimated and undervalued behavior, which can cause the most appalling, undermining of people. And they include, people whose relatives are blown up in terrorist attacks abroad, or who are killed abroad or injured abroad in some criminal activity, where they don't even have the structures we have around us to help support them. And we have to, work with the Foreign Office to try and improve all of that. There is, of course, a big problem about hidden harms, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, trafficking, child abuse, which occupies a great deal of my time. And then there are things like fraud, which are relatively not central to any police force's consideration. For ages, I think we thought of it as almost a victimless crime, because, you think of it as something to do with business, probably, and taking money off people who've got money anyway. But again, if people are scammed, not only do they lose money, but it's also very, very undermines their self-esteem, because they think they've been made a fool of. They've given away their property. So it's capable of being really damaging, and we need to put a better focus on that, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly with you. And just thinking about, the police and crime plan that I have in my area, obviously one of the statutory responsibilities of a police commissioner is to publish that police and crime plan, and the various sort of focus that we put. The police commissioners are supposed to be the victims champion locally, and I'm sort of wincing a little bit, because I'm partly regretting that I did ask you to challenge me as the local commissioner a little bit in terms of, where we were going with things, because a lot of the discussions we've had today with HSCTS and also the force themselves, when we're talking to the Deputy Chief Constable, is about trying to improve the services and acknowledging to some degree that there are areas that we're not performing very well, that we do actually need to address those issues. So are there areas you'd be challenging me as the local commissioner here in the Dyfed-Powys area?
Well, there's lots we can talk about that I think you do well, if I may say so. But there is one thing that I have learned in the last couple of weeks about Dyfed-Powys, policing, and that is in connection with prosecutions of rape. So you know that prosecutions of rape have plummeted over the last few years. The primary culprit is undoubtedly the Crown Prosecution Service, who chose to take, as they put it in the document that was produced at the time, to take weaker cases out of the system. That reduced the first year's prosecutions by 1,000. It produced the next year's prosecutions by 1,000. So whereas prior to that, they've been prosecuting over 3,500 a year of rape cases for the last decade, they now prosecute fewer than 1,800, and consequently they get relatively few convictions. And that's a big deterrent. And I think a fear, and this is what I might be worrying about, is that because the CPS now take, firstly, so few cases, and secondly, what they think of as weak cases are dropped out, whether they are feeding back on the police now, who think, why should I spend, the diligent amount of time I would spend on this if I know the last 6 cases like this have been turned away by the CPS. Now, I don't know if that's what's happening, particularly in Dyfed-Powys, but just a couple of weeks ago, there was a list produced of rape prosecutions in the last year and where the police stand on a sort of hit parade. So the best prosecution police force is Durham, up in the northeast, next door to where I used to be. You will see why I'm not shouting them from the rooftops when I tell you that even they only prosecute 11% of rapes that are brought to them. But right at the bottom of prosecution numbers are Wiltshire and Dyfed-Powys. Dyfed-Powys prosecutes just less than 0.5% of the rapes that come to the police, which means you prosecute something like 20 times fewer cases than Durham does. There's nothing in the statistics to help me know why that should be. Is it a shock to you, David?
I guess that those league tables of comparing forces, are useful to pose those questions as to why. In terms of it being a shock to me that we are down, at so few a level, is something that that it isn't a shock as such, because it's been part of our performance activity with the force to try and understand. And actually, it's one of the key focus areas of the Criminal Justice Board at the moment, is to look at rape and sexual offences and to try and understand, as you describe, how possibly, and again, the reality is that we're looking at it now and we want to try and unpick it and improve that situation. But suspicions are that there could be this sort of shifting back, as you say, from a CPS, because the threshold levels, if the thresholds are deemed to get a bit higher from a CPS perspective, then, as you rightly point out, the police themselves then in their own threshold levels will potentially increase the bar. So it's not a shock as such, but I don't have a specific answer that I can put my finger on that would then, satisfy you, and that we have got a plan in place. So, but we're working on it, which I think is the important point. And I think these league tables of different activity can shine a light to allow, hopefully, if there is best practice in somewhere like Durham, for that to be shared and for some of those experiences to be shared across force areas.
Yeah, I think that's very encouraging that you were looking at it already, and the league tables are helpful in the sense of just showing that disparity and making you everybody think twice. Well, my goodness, we better do something about it if we're in that position. But it seems to me the likelihood that there is something different about rape complaints or rape complainants in Dyfed-Powys or Wiltshire compared to Durham is unlikely, and that it is likely to be something to do with the way they're investigated, or the way people are supported, or the way there are prosecutions or a prosecution block standing in the way. So I'm guessing that it needs a bit of a whole system look. There are big, apart from, no low levels of charging, or rather ahead of low levels of charging, there are high levels now nationwide, and I haven't got a particular figure for you, but there are high levels nationwide of people who report sexual offences and want a prosecution withdrawing before there's any prospect of charging. And that obviously can be for a multitude of reasons, but the survey we did, you're probably aware that we did a survey of rape survivors, as we would be best calling them, last summer. We left it out for 2 months, and all we did was put a questionnaire on our website and said, be careful. If you've been a survivor of rape, you might not want to answer this question because it may just re-trigger, the horrible experience or make you relive it. But if you can, tell us what happened. And quite a large proportion wanted to tell us they'd thought of reporting and then were deterred because they felt that their lifestyle would be challenged. They felt that they would have to prove, that they were a person worthy of being having a prosecution for them. They felt that they wouldn't be believed. And then when we looked at the cohort who had made a report to the police, and let me emphasize, this is not in Dyfed-Powys, this is from everywhere where they chose to come in and answer, they found exactly what the people who didn't report had feared, that they were not readily believed, that their lifestyle was inquired into a very great deal, including, you well know, the taking of mobile phones and an extensive look at all that's on them. And they had a profound sense that they were the person who was being investigated, and not the other person. So you can see that if it's not going well from the top, because we're not going to prosecute many of those kind of cases, where there's maybe she's flirting or whatever these myths are, she's got a short dress on or whatever it is. And so the police don't send many. And so the police become questioning of all those things. Then you can see that a person doesn't get great support from square one and may well drop out. One thing in our report that was very good was to say that if anybody in that position has an independent sexual violence advisor, they are twice as likely to stick with the prosecution than if they don't. So that's a sketch round the topic, really.
Yeah, but that service that you highlight is an important one, isn't it? Both the IDVA from a domestic violence perspective and the ISVA then from a sexual violence perspective is critical. And I know we've got fantastic individuals that work in that area, in the Dyfed-Powys area. It's a commission service from my office, and we work with partner agencies, and it's such an important aspect. But I just wanted to pick up on one point you made around the mobile phones. You've been a big advocate for issues in relation to the disclosure around mobile phone content. So do you want to explain a little bit further in relation to that? It's the fact that, in effect, it's that intrusion, I suppose, into that personal detail on the mobile phone that could have a detrimental impact on people coming forward in that first instance.
Yes, definitely, and an undermining effect when the extensive nature of what's going to be sought is understood. I think you have to say right at the beginning, technology is not perfect. So in a case where, you say somebody says they've been sexually assaulted or raped by somebody they know, were in a relationship with, then, an important line of inquiry is going to be, did you message them? Did they message you? What did you say? And so on. And so people are going to need, evidence around that relationship to otherwise they wouldn't investigate properly what the background to it and the up-to-date stuff is. So that's pretty clear, and nobody disputes that, really. And technology doesn't all that readily allow that just to be limited. But what the big fear is that following that idea that rape complainants get, that they're the one under investigation, what's going on in looking at your mobile phone is seeing what you're like as a person, not confining it to relevant things to the rape inquiry. And there are some, pretty appalling figures. So the CPS drives digital download. So you'll remember, I guess, a case called Liam Allen a few years ago, where a young man was charged with rape. The police had not given him information off a mobile phone that they should have given him. And when it was disclosed, the case was dropped. That, of course, has played a big role in everything about digital download since. But the fact is, they had that material. They should have given it him. It was highly relevant. And as I say, nobody doubts that, if you've had a relationship with the person, you've got to give them everything about that, so that what helps you and what helps them is completely exposed. But the consequence of it wasn't, to wrap the police in wherever it was over the knuckles and say, you disclose properly. It was to say, give me more information off all of these mobile phones, so we never get caught out again. And the Independent Information Commissioner's Office have found that in about half of cases that they looked at, the searches of mobile phones had been over intrusive. They found the CPS pushed the police and have, since that case, insisted on full downloads of all relevant material, before they'd even consider a charge. So the police have to do it right up at the front, and they are pushed. So the CPS themselves found that in 60% of their cases, they'd been over intrusive and irrational in what they'd demanded. But I've fairly recently seen a report in which the CPS are saying we want all the digital download we can possibly get as early as possible. Now, that's just completely wrong and impossible to sustain in terms of public confidence, because, all sorts of things are on your mobile phone. We had a case in Northumbria where a woman did make a complaint and intended to stick with it. They wanted her mobile phone. She knew that a couple of weeks before, her 15-year-old brother had nicked a bottle of wine, and he and his mates had sat outside drinking it. And she got emails from him about it. She's not going to grass her brother up to the police in order to make a complaint of rape. And she got no guarantee that she wouldn't cause him damage, if they just had all her phone. I mean, the police would say, of course, we would not be bothering with that. That's not what we're looking for. But she can't feel like that. So it's other people's messages. And also, a great deal of dredging up, inconsequential but personal behavior, that flirting with another person, or telling a lie to her mum on a mobile phone, or whatever it is. Well, I mean, to be honest, the search for the perfect victim is going to be a fruitless one. And it oughtn't to be the case that stuff like that that's found on a mobile phone deters the police from going ahead on the basis that might give rise to some cross-examination that can undermine her. I mean, it's not a story about phone material, but there's a parallel search, of course, for medical notes, psychiatric notes, school reports, any social services notes that there are, which are usually not digital these days. And we had a case in Northumbria, again, where a young woman of about 23 or 24, alleging rape in one of those Rotherham type cases where there was a gang operating, had put to her in cross-examination that she'd always been a liar and she was lying about this. And she was presented with a letter written when she was about 13 or 14, in which she had told her teacher that she couldn't go to the swimming pool because she was ill, and she'd forged her mum's signature. And this was put to her in cross-examination. Now, it's utterly irrelevant. It is shocking to the person who is suddenly confronted with that, who thinks, my God, what have they got? They got my birth certificate, And yet, I, as a defence barrister, know I could make a right meal out of that, and have a really good impact on a jury. So it's grossly unfair stuff. And that's come because the disclosure up front is like massively there and utterly irrelevant to the actual facts of the case. So it's a huge problem. It's getting better in the sense that the police have now really appreciated the impact on public confidence that it's having. But there's some new legislation coming up which is not really going to be going in the right direction. And that's going to be one of the next things that I'm tangling with, some new legislation.
Yeah. So, seemingly stacked against the victim in that sense, with putting influencing and putting barriers in some respects between the victim and the reporting of that incident, which is sad. I want to also come back to a point you made earlier about antisocial behaviour.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm trying to push in this force then is the community trigger and the understanding that is there and available for people. Again, not many people aren't aware of it and don't know that actually there is an opportunity to instigate that activity. Would you agree that is something that I should be championing?
Yeah, I do. And I think you've always had a very strong understanding of the damage that can be caused by antisocial behaviour, because you've talked about it a lot in past conversations at the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. Yeah, the community trigger is very important. And I've been trying to promote it too, because it's a bit of citizen empowerment, isn't it? If you're suffering antisocial behaviour at home, which is, can become in the end, you feel targeted, you feel a bit demeaned, you're entitled when you've tried 3 times is usually the count, but you can vary the trigger point. You've tried 3 times, maybe the police and the local authority and your housing association or any of them, and you've got nowhere. You're entitled to press this trigger, and then they all have to come together and work out a solution to the problem. And it isn't known of. You're quite right. I mean, we need to promote them on our own websites. You need to promote it locally. The local council needs to promote it strongly. And people, so we got a letter sent from the Home Office to MPs, because MPs on behalf of constituents can press the trigger. Councillors can press the trigger. And what has happened is where the trigger's been pressed, sometimes the 3-ish, maybe more, police, council, housing association who come together to sort it haven't invited the victim to the resolution meeting, and they need to go so they can set out how it's harming them and also guide how it could be solved. So I think there's a lot of work to do. It's great that you've got your teeth into that one there.
Yeah, well, it sort of forms part of the refresh that we've done with neighbourhood policing teams as well. So we've tried to embed a problem-solving approach into the neighbourhood policing teams, so that when they are confronted with an issue, that it isn't just something that they task and finish and just respond to time after time, but they sort of sit back a little bit and think of trying to problem solve the issues, and that's taken some time actually, and there is a sort of a specific culture that you need to breed within the neighbourhood policing teams to see the issues of that nature. As it happens, on Monday, I'm going to a particular issue in one of our communities with a local sergeant just to have a conversation about what could be done to try and problem solve. So that's how we've framed it. We've tried to frame it within the suite of activity within the neighbourhood policing team activity, really.
Yeah, neighbourhood policing is terrific, isn't it? I mean, I remember well how under those cuts that we all had to suffer to policing prior to the government reversing its stance and trying to bring back 20,000 police, having just scrapped about 25,000, in trying to keep neighbourhood policing going. Was incredibly important, because it was easy to chop it, because you can't count the arrests, you can't count the convictions. It's not easily seen, as proving itself, but it does an enormous amount of good in prevention, does a fantastic amount of good in terms of information, doesn't it? You get intelligence from people saying stuff, I don't know what's going on at number 6, but and I don't want to waste your time, but I'm a bit worried about it. And then people find there's a major drugs den or something. There was one PCSO in Northumbria whose beat was in a particular location. It's the east end of Newcastle, and it has a big long road called Shields Road in it, and it probably is 3/4 of a mile. And her boss used to say she can't get from one end to the next during a shift because she stops so many times, and people want to tell her so much, and they want to ask her so much. That's the perfect model, isn't it?
It is.
She used to be an estate agent before she was a PCSO. So she's good with people. Do you know what I mean?
And that's the key to it. We're very fortunate to have the support of Welsh Government here in Wales as well. So we've got 50% of our community support officers are funded by a Welsh Government grant. So we've been able to retain the police community support officers walking and being visible in the communities. And similar to your example of the PCSO that can't walk the mile stretch of road, we've got individuals that are known, by their personal first name, actually, by the whole community. And I dread to think if we ever get a situation where we have to take those resources out. Yeah, that would be a sad day, because neighbourhood policing is the sort of cornerstone to certainly the policing here in Dyfed-Powys, but also in a wider sense across Wales. So I've got there are some messages, and I got one of our councillors who's on the police and crime panel, William Powell, has commented about the community trigger. It was something actually the police and crime panel themselves took interest in, the antisocial behaviour incidents in the force.
Great.
So I'm pleased we've got people listening to us and making comment of some of the things that you're saying, Vera. So one thing I wanted to explore with you as well. So you've been calling and are calling for a victims' law to be introduced. Would you? I'm going to frame it in this way, and you can tell me off or agree in whatever measure. Do you think it's quite sad that potentially you feel that those victims' rights need to be legislated for? We've had the Victims Code of Practice in place. You mentioned that it's being tweaked, and there'll be the version 2 is it's actually probably more like version 3 or 4, actually, if I'm honest.
It is.
But we've got those things in place. So is it a bit sad that we have to possibly legislate for things that you would expect would just happen?
Yeah, it is, but it's, and I mean, I've got a kind of theory about it, but it is a shame. I think it's number 4, this Victims Code. They are not implemented. My predecessor in this role did a thing about, the victim personal statement, which is a very important thing for victims who've been a victim of crime, who've been affected by it. It's their opportunity to express to the court when it comes to sentencing, if it does, how the crime has affected them. She did a survey every year while she was the victims commissioner, so for 5 years, and she found that consistently only 17% of people who'd been victims of crime had ever heard of a victim personal statement and had ever remembered being offered one. So that's a key right, and there are 20 now. I've got the thing here as it happens, just because we're looking at implementation of it, and there is an implementation board, but it's now better than it's ever been. It's got 12 key rights that are pretty clear. The trouble is, of course, that there are no individual agencies' obligation to deliver. So, for instance, and they're not really expressed as rights either. I mean, you should get consistent information about a case. So if that people are very pleased with the police response to crime, usually. I don't know if that's the same with you. I'm guessing it will be. They say the cops come out quickly. They are very polite. They're very effective. They do all the right, checking if you're safe and all the right investigative noises, and people are very pleased and think that's great. They're going to take this issue on, and then they tend not. I'm not saying specifically in Dyfed-Powys, but generally they tend not to stay in touch, not to give information, not to give updates. So people don't know, has somebody been arrested? Or will they never be arrested? Is it just an impossible case? Were there any fingerprints? Because they came and took them. Is somebody been charged? Is he been charged? Is he on bail? I might meet him. Or is he in prison 300 miles away? Is somebody going to go to court? And people just don't get to know that information from the police who should deliver it, or from the CPS when it goes into their territory. And so in the end, they feel quite neglected, and as if, the police have kind of ticked the box. They've done their bit, and they've just, the rest, they are left themselves to cope with their crime. People are supposed to be referred to victim services, and that's a very, very good thing, because, almost everybody's affected in some way by a crime. But 20% of victims who report to the police get referred to victim services. And in some places, and I think it's a good system to have, there's a kind of, you are reported to the victim services unless you tell me you don't want to be. So it's kind of that way around. And then the victim services get in touch. But still, it's not a lot of people who end up with good victim services, because I don't think that's done well either. And there are all sorts of things, going to court. One of the rights includes that you should, if you're a victim, you should be able to go to court through a separate entrance and stay in a separate waiting room from the defendant. And the right sets out that you are entitled to that, but it continues. However, in quite a lot of courts, there aren't separate entrances and separate waiting rooms. So the HMCTS will do their best. Well, if this is a right, I'm entitled to it. And if it were a right and treated as one, they'd have to build a flipping separate entrance and a waiting room, wouldn't they? To make sure I had one. They could easily sort it out. Yeah. But because they are not taken seriously, it's left like that, And if we can't, in a 21st century England and Wales, guarantee that somebody whose child's been run over by a hit and run driver, we can't guarantee they won't have to meet them in the waiting room at court. That's a terrible, terrible position. But of course, the focus is on the defendant, and I don't criticize that. I was a defense lawyer. I want defendants to have all the rights they're entitled to, put a red circle around them and leave them there. But you do have to treat victims with dignity, keep them updated, give them support, give them their entitlements. Otherwise, they will just drop out, as we've already discussed, we're seeing with rape. But it looks now as if with 25% of all kinds of case, not just rape, domestic abuse, the really hard ones, people are reporting it and then just dropping out. So there's a big job to do, and it probably is going to take legislation to compel the agencies to focus not only on the investigation, the prosecution, the trial of the defendant, but save some time for the defendant, the victim's rights as well. I mean, I'm not saying people are unkind. Lots of people have loads of praise for their officer or for the court staff, but that's because people are kind. Do you know what I mean? It's not a systematic support system that you can rely on. So I'm afraid you do need legislation, and you're right, it's a shame.
Yeah, and just the point you made in relation to the consent to be referred to the victim services, that is certainly something that we've struggled with a little bit in the force area here. So I recommissioned our victim services, and we have an internal, it's independent, but it's an internally delivered victim service, and the idea behind it was so that it could become more seamless. Is that the right way to describe it?
That sounds great. I think more and more people are taking them in to the PCC's domain, as it were, and that's just a better way of kind of keeping a closer eye on it and making sure it fits all the other things you're trying to do with the police, and that the two work together well. I must say, I do think that the role of the Police and Crime Commissioner is a very good one. Do you? I mean, you've been in it for a few years now.
Yeah, I was probably one of the skeptics. In fact, I worked in the force as an intelligence analyst when the first transition occurred. I was working here in Dyfed-Powys, and it was an interesting time for that transition. I can only describe it as there was an element of a power struggle at play between chief officers and police commissioners, and you lived through some of that yourself because of the role that you had as a police commissioner. So you would have perhaps had more first-hand experience of that than I did at the time, because I came in the second term. That I'm a second-term commissioner. I think a lot of the arguing and the falling out had sort of happened prior to me arriving. But having that sceptical view in the first instance, working in the role for the last 5 years, I can see how much of an influential role it can be, and how powerful it can be to work as a catalyst for positive change. Now, you talked about an area that perhaps I should focus on to change in Dyfed-Powys around prosecutions, in particular of sexual violence. But linked to that, we have a bit of an issue in the force as well, and I think it's to do with the fact that we're a community that very often will know other people in the community, but we have known suspects to cases, but then the victim withdraws from withdraws the support for the prosecution over time. And I think there's probably an element of that at play within the sexual violence figures that you mentioned, because of the links, whether it be familial links or to the community. But that is something that we're trying to, again, address and understand. Why have we got so many of our cases and investigations where we've got a known suspect and we still can't get them through to prosecution? It's frustrating.
Yeah, very, very frustrating. But I think, you as the sort of people's voice in policing, aren't you? With the power on their behalf to kind of make these requirements of the police, who, are pretty conscientious anyway. But nonetheless, you're there and they can't avoid taking a look at the things that you say. Look, the public are worried about this. Let's get on with it. I felt that was a role that was a good one. And I was a first-time PCC, as you know. I was elected when the first came on in deep, dark, freezing November 2012, the most curious time in the world to have an election. And you're right, most or many of the kind of ups and downs between chief constables and PCCs happened in that first stretch. Some people who'd been police officers in the same force suddenly became the PCC over somebody who'd been their boss. That can't be a very happy situation. But I found in my area, and I had 3 PCCs. I had 3 chief constables. The first one, Sue, left because she was retiring. The middle one left for family reasons after a couple of years. So I mean, both were really good in their own ways. And the third one, Winton, is still there. But with each of them, I didn't find it difficult to find the border of my role. I never, I mean, I don't know anything about operational policing. Why would I try to get into that? And they understood when they were getting into, policy making that was political. And if we ever thought we might clash, we just talked about it, and sorted out where we were going. And I kind of more or less always supported them publicly, but was, sometimes quite critical in private. We scrutinized them pretty strongly to try and keep the justification for praising them publicly. But I think it can work, and I think you make a difference, David, if you don't mind me saying so. And I think what's great in Wales is the way you all work together so well. So I know Alan Michael very well from South Wales. I know Jeff Cuthbert very well, but I know Arvon as well. Because you all come together, as I understand it. Are you all on the Welsh Criminal Justice Board? Because I've just been invited to join the Welsh Criminal Justice Board.
Yeah, we are, and you are right. We do work very closely together, and it's been quite a collegiate, constructive relationship over the last 4 or 5 years, which I think has led to really fantastic things happening in Wales. We've now got a community safety network that's been developed and funded and supported. You mentioned the Criminal Justice Board for Wales, which is going from strength to strength, and we've also got a policing partnership board for Wales, where the First Minister, Mark Draper himself, actually has chaired. He chairs one meeting a year, and then the Deputy First Minister chairs the quarterly meetings that we have. We sometimes, do we overemphasize it? I don't know, but we are fortunate. I think for me, it's one of the dynamic byproducts of Wales being a small nation, that it means that we can be nimble and we can get together and get things done quite quickly and efficiently. So I like to think that I've played my small sort of part in and contributed to that over the last few years, and long may it continue, I hope. But of course, we've got the elections in May, so it might all change. And in fact, Arfon in North Wales is not standing again. He's decided not to stand. So, but you'll be a welcome addition to the board, Vera, to discuss the issues from a victim's perspective, because we are seriously trying to ensure that the victim is at the heart of the service in Wales, not just the policing service, but the wider criminal justice service. And your insight and input would be very valuable to us.
I'm very pleased to have been asked, actually. So it's obviously going through a sort of uplift, isn't it? And as you say, going from strength to strength. So it's brilliant to be on that. And yeah, I think it's not just that the 4 commissioners have worked well. I think, when I talk to Alan quite a little bit in South Wales, so I've known him many, many years. When I was in Parliament, of course, he was the Deputy Home Secretary and all. I mean, you won't necessarily have had it at the forefront of your mind, but he took the anti-hunting bill through the legislation, and I was there pushing him from behind all the time, as it were. So I know him well. And he says, and I know that he's right, that all the agencies seem to cooperate very, very well, I think, in Wales as well. I mean, obviously you will have your fallouts, but it looks as if that smallness, that ability to innovate and lead the way sometimes means you all pull together pretty effectively. That's how it looks to me anyway. So I'm pleased to be on a board that will be reflecting that.
Brilliant. Vera, it's probably quite a nice place to end the conversation there, isn't it? Lots of positivity. I'm really grateful that you were able to support the conference today and come on to this sort of new platform, different sort of embracing technology to get some of the key messages out to the public about the work of myself as the police commissioner, but also putting a focus and shining a light really on victim services and the work that goes into trying to ensure the victims at the heart of the service. We say it a lot of the time, but
we do.
This has demonstrated that there is a lot of activity at play. So I'm really grateful. Thank you very much for your time.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thanks for the invitation. Take good care.
Bye. Thank you.